Do not let a human sit at your table, the old dealer said as he quietly removed a polished deck of crystal cards from the center of the room. If you do, the game stops being about luck. Every rookie at the Grand Orion Casino laughed the first time they heard those words. They thought it was another exaggerated story told by tired veterans who had spent too many years watching wealthy travelers lose fortunes across the stars. After all, humanity had only been part of the Galactic Trade Network for a little over 20 years. They were newcomers. Their ships were sturdy but plain. Their clothes looked ordinary. Their diplomats smiled too much. Their engineers always smelled faintly of coffee and machine oil. Nobody seriously believed they possessed some mysterious gift. Yet every licensed casino from the core worlds to the outer rim displayed the same quiet policy somewhere behind the staff entrance. Human guests were welcome. Human money was welcome. Human friendships were welcome. But games of chance involving humans required executive approval. Most visitors never noticed the policy. Those who did assumed it was some outdated insurance rule. Only the oldest managers knew it had been written after several incidents that no mathematician had ever been able to explain. Director Salith remembered the first time he saw that rule. He had been a young researcher with flawless academic scores and complete faith in probability theory. His professors taught that every uncertain event could be modeled. Every decision could be predicted. Every outcome eventually surrendered to enough data. Emotion was merely noise. Intuition was an illusion. Luck was only mathematics waiting to be understood. He believed every word. Standing before a lecture hall filled with students decades later, Salith rested one blue metallic hand on the edge of the podium and looked across hundreds of eager faces. You have all memorized the equations, he said. You understand probability. You understand statistics. Today I am going to teach you why every one of those equations failed. Curious whispers spread through the room. One student slowly raised her hand. Professor, is this about the human? Salith gave a slow nod. Yes. Another student frowned. But humans are not telepathic. Correct. They cannot predict the future. Correct. Then why did the council classify them as a statistical anomaly? For several long seconds, Salith did not answer. Instead, he activated the massive display behind him. A single image appeared on the screen. It showed a smiling man in his 30s wearing a faded Denver Broncos cap, jeans, and an old gray jacket, while carrying 2 paper cups of coffee through a crowded space station terminal. He looked like someone who might apologize for bumping into you at the grocery store. Nothing about him suggested danger. Nothing about him suggested history. His name, Salith finally said, is Mason Carter. A few students exchanged puzzled looks. One quietly laughed. That is him. That is the human everyone talks about. Yes. He does not look remarkable. He is not, Salith answered calmly. That is exactly why everyone underestimated him. The room grew silent. Salith folded his hands behind his back and stared at Mason's ordinary smile frozen on the screen. People believe this story is about gambling, he continued. It is not. It is about something far more unsettling. Another student leaned forward. What could possibly frighten an entire galaxy more than impossible luck? Salith looked directly at the class before answering in a voice so quiet that every student instinctively leaned closer to hear it. Because the day we met Mason Carter, we discovered humans were never gambling against probability. He paused, letting the silence settle over the room. They were gambling against us. Mason Carter never planned to become part of anyone else's history. He was just trying to make a decent living. Every weekday started the same way. He grabbed black coffee from a corner shop 2 blocks from his apartment, complained about traffic even though most of it flew overhead now, and caught the commuter shuttle to Orion Freight Analytics, where he spent 8 hours studying shipping routes, fuel costs, and risk reports. His coworkers liked him because he never made simple problems complicated. If someone needed help, Mason usually figured out the answer while stirring cream into his coffee. If someone else deserved credit, he never argued. To most people, he was simply the dependable guy who always remembered birthdays and somehow kept a spare phone charger for everyone. Friday evenings were different. A handful of employees gathered at Murphy's Landing, a neighborhood bar tucked beneath one of Denver Station's older transit platforms. They ordered burgers, watched baseball broadcasts from Earth, argued about football, and played low-stakes poker until closing time. Mason rarely won every game. In fact, He intentionally folded more hands than most people thought made sense. His friend Ryan laughed one night as Mason slid another decent hand into the discard pile. You know, if you actually played those cards, you would probably beat us every week. Mason shrugged with a grin. Maybe, but then nobody would invite me back. Everyone laughed because it sounded exactly like something Mason would say. He enjoyed the conversations more than the money anyway. Several months later, Orion Freight assigned Mason to accompany a logistics delegation visiting Meridian Station, one of the busiest commercial hubs in explored space. It was his first trip beyond human-controlled territory. The station was enormous, stretching nearly 3 miles from end to end, filled with languages, colors, and architecture that looked more like sculpture than engineering. Mason spent his first afternoon staring through a glass observation wall while freighters drifted silently against the stars. Pretty incredible, huh? Asked a woman wearing an Orion Freight badge. Never thought I would actually see this place, Mason admitted. Pictures never get it right. That evening, several alien trade officials invited the human delegation to what they described as a friendly cultural exchange inside a licensed gaming lounge. Nobody mentioned serious gambling. Nobody expected anything unusual. The atmosphere felt closer to co-workers relaxing after a conference than strangers competing for money. Mason almost declined until one of the organizers smiled and said, "Come on, think of it as learning our customs." Inside, the room looked surprisingly familiar. Comfortable chairs, soft music, drinks being served, laughter floating between tables. The biggest difference was the cards themselves. Instead of paper, they were made from thin, transparent crystals that shimmered whenever someone touched them. Across the table sat 3 Virex merchants and a retired transport captain from another world whose easy smile reminded Mason of his grandfather. "Have you ever played probability cards before?" one merchant asked. Mason chuckled. "First time. You might have to explain the rules twice." The merchant looked relieved. "Excellent. Beginners are always the most entertaining." Mason listened carefully as the rules were explained. He asked simple questions. He even admitted when something confused him. Nobody saw confidence. Nobody saw strategy. They saw an ordinary human trying not to embarrass himself in front of new business partners. From the balcony above, an elderly casino supervisor quietly stopped walking. He watched Mason for several seconds before speaking into a small communicator clipped beneath his jacket. "This is Supervisor Kellen. Please notify executive management." The voice on the other end sounded puzzled. Why? Kellen never took his eyes off the smiling human below. Because a human just agreed to sit at table 12. Supervisor Kellen arrived less than 2 minutes later, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 40 years watching fortunes appear and disappear across polished tables. He did not interrupt the game. He simply stood near the back wall with his arms folded, studying the human more closely than the cards. Mason looked exactly the same as when he walked in. He smiled politely whenever another player joked. He thanked the server each time she refilled his coffee. He even apologized after accidentally slowing the game because he needed one of the rules explained again. "He really has never played this version before," one Virex merchant whispered. "Of course not," another replied. "Humans barely joined interstellar commerce. This should be easy." The first several rounds seemed to confirm that assumption. Mason lost a few small hands. He shrugged every time it happened. "Guess I am still learning," he said with an embarrassed laugh. The others relaxed. They became louder. Drinks kept arriving. Stories replaced careful thinking. One player began celebrating every lucky draw before the round had even finished. Another teased Mason about beginners' luck disappearing. Mason simply smiled and listened. From the balcony, Kellen quietly shook his head. A young assistant standing beside him frowned. "I do not understand." "He is losing," Kellen answered without taking his eyes off the table. "No, he is collecting information." The assistant blinked. "About the game?" "No." Kellen pointed toward the players one by one. "About them." Down below, Mason leaned back as another hand was dealt. His cards were average. Nothing exciting. Ryan would have played them back home. Half the people at Murphy's Landing probably would have stayed in just to see what happened. Instead, Mason folded almost immediately. One merchant grinned. "You surrender too easily, my friend." Mason chuckled. "Maybe. My dad used to tell me there is no shame in passing on a bad bet." Everyone laughed except Kellen. He recognized something the others completely missed. Mason had not looked at his own cards for more than 2 seconds. He had spent the rest of the hand watching everyone else's faces, watching breathing patterns, watching who reached for a drink after bluffing, watching who smiled too quickly after receiving strong cards, watching who looked confident only when they were nervous. None of it was supernatural. None of it broke mathematics. It was simply observation sharpened by a lifetime of ordinary human experiences. Family card nights, friendly poker games, business meetings, job interviews, countless conversations where success depended less on numbers than on understanding people. Another hour passed. The merchants became increasingly comfortable. They started increasing their wagers without discussing it. One captain could not stop tapping 3 fingers against the table whenever he believed he was winning. Another always adjusted the collar of his jacket before attempting a bluff. Mason noticed every habit without appearing to notice anything at all. Then something changed. For the first time that evening, Mason stopped folding. He quietly slid his chips toward the center. The merchant across from him smiled with obvious confidence. Finally feeling lucky? Mason gave a small shrug. Not really. Then why stay in? Mason looked around the table before answering with an easy smile. Because I think everybody else feels lucky enough for all of us. The sentence sounded harmless, even friendly. The table laughed again. But Kellen felt the same uneasy sensation he had experienced years earlier watching another human play the exact same way. They were all staring at the cards. Mason was not playing the cards anymore. He was playing the people holding them. Mason won that hand by the smallest possible margin. No dramatic celebration. No clever speech. He simply gathered the chips with an apologetic smile and thanked the dealer before taking another sip of coffee. The merchant across from him laughed it off. Looks like the beginner finally caught a break. Mason smiled. Maybe I did. The game continued, but something invisible had shifted around the table. Players who had been relaxed 20 minutes earlier suddenly became cautious. They were no longer trying to beat the game. They were trying to understand the human. Every time Mason folded early, they questioned whether they should have stayed in. Every time he stayed, they wondered what he had seen. The cards had not changed, but the room had. Supervisor Kellen quietly walked down from the balcony and approached the dealer during a short break. How long has the table been active? Almost 2 hours, the dealer answered softly. Anything unusual? The dealer hesitated before replying. Nothing I can prove. Kellen nodded. That is usually how it begins. Across the room, one of the Virex merchants named Torvin could not stop thinking about Mason's decisions. According to every statistical model, the human should have been losing more often. Instead, he kept avoiding expensive mistakes while collecting modest victories that slowly added up. You are impossible to read, Torvin finally admitted with a friendly grin. Mason laughed. My wife says the opposite. Then tell me your secret. Mason leaned back in his chair. Honestly, I do not think about secrets. I just try not to make decisions when I am excited. Torvin frowned. That cannot be enough. Maybe not, Mason replied. But it keeps me from talking myself into bad ideas. The conversation drifted to ordinary things after that. Baseball. Traffic back on Earth. The best barbecue Mason had ever eaten in Texas. The Virex merchants seemed surprised that humans could spend 10 minutes passionately debating smoked brisket. They expected mysterious strategies. Instead, they found stories about family road trips and neighborhood diners. The atmosphere relaxed again, exactly as Mason seemed to prefer. Then the casino announced a special exhibition event. A visiting delegation from the Galactic Institute of Probability had arrived on Meridian Station, and one of their researchers suggested opening a high-profile demonstration table for invited guests. The prize itself was not enormous. The real reward was prestige. The Institute rarely participated in public games because its scholars believed chance could always be explained through mathematics. Torvin looked at Mason with a smile. You should join us. Mason nearly laughed. Absolutely not. Why? Because I came here to finish a shipping conference, not embarrass myself in front of scientists. Another merchant leaned forward. That is exactly why you should play. Nobody expects anything from you. Mason rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. I am not some professional gambler. We know, Torvin replied. That makes it more interesting. From the other side of the room, Supervisor Kellen quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had seen this pattern before. Ordinary game. Curious observers. Growing confidence. Then someone always made the same mistake. They stopped treating the human like a tourist and started treating him like a puzzle that needed solving. Kellen reached for his communicator once more. Executive office, the familiar voice answered. Yes. Kellen spoke slowly, choosing every word with care. Contact the Galactic Institute before they begin tomorrow's exhibition. What should I tell them? Kellen watched Mason laughing over another harmless conversation, looking like the most average man in the entire casino. Tell them they are about to conduct an experiment. He paused before adding quietly. They just do not realize the experiment is going to be on them. Mason almost walked away the next morning. Standing outside the exhibition hall with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and his conference badge hanging from his jacket, he stared at the enormous banner welcoming delegates from the Galactic Institute of Probability and quietly muttered, "This is getting way bigger than I signed up for." His coworker Lisa Reynolds laughed beside him. Then say no. Mason looked through the open doors where dozens of scholars, traders, and observers were already gathering around the featured table. I probably should. Then why are you still standing here? Mason smiled to himself. Because if I leave now, everybody is going to think humans are scared of a card game. Lisa rolled her eyes. You really are impossible. Inside the hall, Director Salith was not interested in winning money. The prize fund barely registered in the Institute's annual budget. He wanted data. Pure, measurable, repeatable data. Every movement at the table would be recorded. Every heartbeat, every decision delay, every change in betting behavior would be analyzed afterward by predictive systems considered the most advanced in the galaxy. We will finally answer the rumors, one researcher said confidently. Either the human possesses an unknown statistical method or the stories are exaggerated. Salif nodded. There is always an explanation. Mason was introduced with almost embarrassing simplicity. Representative from Orion Freight Analytics. No championship titles. No gambling reputation. No academic honors. A few people in the audience exchanged confused looks. That is the famous human, one observer whispered. He works in logistics? Another shrugged. Perhaps the stories have grown over time. Mason sat down and adjusted his chair. He smiled politely at the three researchers seated across from him. Just so we are clear, he said, I still think this is a terrible idea. One researcher laughed. Afraid of losing? Mason grinned. Honestly, I am more afraid of disappointing my boss if I miss my afternoon meeting. The room laughed with him, and the tension eased. The first several rounds unfolded exactly as the Institute expected. Mason folded repeatedly. He passed on decent hands. He ignored opportunities that looked profitable according to standard probability models. One researcher quietly whispered, his decision quality is below optimal. Another nodded while studying a floating display. His expected return should already be negative. Salith remained silent. He noticed something different. Every time Mason folded, the researchers became slightly more confident. Every confident smile lasted a little longer. Every prediction became a little bolder. The cards were influencing the players, but the players were also influencing one another. Mason appeared to notice every tiny shift without ever staring directly at anyone. Then came a hand that every predictive model labeled highly favorable for the lead researcher. The audience expected him to increase his wager immediately. Instead, he hesitated. Mason had spent nearly an hour creating uncertainty without saying a single intimidating word. The researcher glanced toward Mason for less than a second before making a smaller wager than his own model recommended. Another researcher followed his cautious lead. A third unexpectedly folded a strong position altogether. Mason looked down at his own cards, smiled faintly, and quietly matched the reduced wager. Minutes later, the hand ended with Mason collecting another modest victory. Nothing spectacular, just another careful win. The audience seemed confused. One analyst stared at the simulation results flashing across his tablet. This cannot be right, he whispered. The probabilities were accurate. Salith answered without looking away from the table. The probabilities were never the problem. Around them, the room grew noticeably quieter as scholars began reviewing their numbers instead of watching the game. For the first time in the Institute's history, the equations had predicted the cards correctly, yet they had completely failed to predict the people holding them. When the exhibition ended, nobody rushed to congratulate Mason. Nobody accused him of cheating either. The room simply filled with an uncomfortable silence that no one quite knew how to explain. Mason stood up, stretched his shoulders, and smiled at the researchers across the table. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That was actually a lot more fun than I expected." One of the younger analysts blinked in disbelief. "You had fun?" Mason laughed. "Sure. You all made me think. That is my favorite kind of game." He shook hands with everyone at the table, wished them luck with their research, and excused himself because he still had a logistics presentation scheduled in less than an hour. Within seconds of the human leaving the room, every conversation changed. The researchers stopped discussing individual hands and began arguing over their data. Floating displays covered the conference table as thousands of recorded decisions replayed from every possible angle. Heart rates, eye movements, reaction times, betting patterns. Every measurable variable matched the Institute's expectations. Every statistical model describing the cards had performed almost perfectly. Yet the final outcomes kept drifting toward Mason. "Run the simulations again," one analyst said. "Already did." "Then increase the behavioral variables." "Done." "What changed?" The analyst looked up with genuine confusion. "Nothing we can identify." Director Salith quietly walked to the center display and studied Mason's timeline one more time. The human had never made impossible decisions. He had never guessed hidden information. In fact, several of his choices were mathematically less profitable than the alternatives. Then why did he keep gaining ground? Another researcher asked. Nobody answered. Hours passed. More simulations were launched. Artificial intelligence systems generated millions of alternative scenarios. Every version reached nearly the same conclusion. Mason's advantage did not come from predicting random events. It appeared only after other players began reacting to him. One senior behavioral scientist suddenly frowned. Wait. Every head turned toward her. She enlarged a chart showing confidence levels throughout the exhibition. The cards never changed. She highlighted another graph. The probabilities never changed. Then she overlaid emotional response data collected from every participant. We changed. The room fell quiet again. Salith slowly nodded as realization began settling across the room. He never manipulated probability, he said softly. He manipulated certainty. Another researcher objected. But he barely spoke. Exactly, Salith replied. Every time he folded, they assumed he lacked confidence. Every time he entered a hand, they questioned their own confidence. Eventually, they stopped trusting themselves. One analyst stared at Mason's recorded interviews from earlier that morning. Every answer sounded ordinary. Every smile looked genuine. Every joke felt effortless. He was not pretending to be average, the analyst whispered. He actually is average. Yes, Salith answered. That is the most dangerous part. He enlarged Mason's employment file. Orion Freight Analytics. Risk assessment specialist. Volunteer youth baseball coach on weekends. No military background. No advanced psychology degree. No classified training. Just an ordinary American who had spent his life solving practical problems and paying attention to people. Salith leaned back in his chair, remembering something Mason had said during a coffee break when one researcher asked how he decided whether to trust someone. Mason had smiled before answering. You cannot always tell when somebody is lying, but you can usually tell when they are trying too hard to be believed. At the time, everyone had laughed. Now nobody did. The Institute had searched for hidden algorithms, secret techniques, and impossible talents because they assumed extraordinary outcomes required extraordinary people. Instead, they found something much more unsettling. Human beings had evolved on a world where survival often depended on reading imperfect information, adapting to uncertainty, and making decisions before complete facts existed. The equations had never been wrong. They had simply been incomplete. And for the first time in his distinguished career, Director Salith found himself writing a sentence that no scientist enjoyed placing into an official report. Human behavior cannot be fully understood through probability alone. The Institute refused to publish its conclusions. Instead, Director Salith proposed one final experiment. If our theory is correct, he told the review board, then Mason Carter is not exceptional. He is simply demonstrating a pattern that other humans might also possess. We need a game where observation alone should not be enough. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived in Mason's inbox while he was eating lunch at his desk. He nearly deleted it as spam. The subject line read, Invitation to the Cognitive Probability Challenge. Lisa Reynolds glanced over his shoulder. Please tell me you are not thinking about accepting that. Mason laughed. I was thinking about pretending I never saw it. That is probably the smartest decision you have made all month. He nodded in agreement, but curiosity lingered. The invitation promised something completely different. No familiar cards. No recognizable rules. Every participant would receive instructions only moments before the competition began. The game itself had never been played before. No historical data existed. No one could prepare. Now that, Mason muttered, actually sounds terrifying. He accepted anyway. The challenge took place inside a circular chamber designed specifically for behavioral research. 8 contestants sat around a smooth black table. Scholars from 6 civilizations filled the observation gallery above. Hidden behind reinforced glass, hundreds of sensors tracked every heartbeat, every eye movement, every hesitation. Mason looked around at the unfamiliar faces and quietly smiled. "Well," he said, "I guess we are all beginners today." Nobody smiled back. Director Salith stepped into the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's exercise has no historical strategy, no established theory. No participant has seen these rules before this moment. Every decision will involve incomplete information. Begin." Digital panels illuminated across the table. The instructions were surprisingly simple, yet every choice affected everyone else's possible outcomes in ways that changed from round to round. There was no perfect strategy because the structure itself evolved as players adapted. Within minutes, the room became noticeably tense. One contestant began reading every line repeatedly before acting. Another changed decisions halfway through each round. A third trusted the computer's probability recommendations so completely that he ignored obvious behavioral changes around the table. Mason felt his pulse quicken. For the first time since arriving on Meridian Station, he genuinely had no idea what the correct move might be. He leaned back, rubbed his chin, and quietly admitted to himself, "I have got nothing." The uncertainty bothered him more than he expected. Then an old memory surfaced. Friday nights at Murphy's Landing. His father laughing across a kitchen table years before that. One simple piece of advice that had nothing to do with cards. If you cannot predict what happens next, pay attention to how people react when they cannot predict it either. Mason stopped studying the screen. Instead, he watched the room. One contestant rushed every decision whenever he felt uncomfortable. Another became overly cautious after a single mistake. Someone else kept looking toward the participant they secretly considered the smartest. Nobody realized they were revealing more about themselves than about the game. Mason still made mistakes. He even lost several early rounds. But unlike everyone else, he never chased those losses. He never tried to force the next decision to erase the previous one. He accepted uncertainty, adjusted, and moved forward. From the observation gallery, one young researcher whispered, "He is not solving the game." Director Salith slowly nodded without taking his eyes off the human below. "No," he replied. "He is solving the players again." The final rounds unfolded so quietly that many people in the observation gallery forgot to breathe. Nobody at the table looked confident anymore. The contestants had stopped trusting the predictions on their displays because every unexpected decision forced them to question the next one. The room had become a contest of patience instead of calculation. Mason glanced at the changing numbers on his screen and slowly pushed his chair back an inch. He rubbed his eyes and smiled to himself. "I am overthinking this," he whispered. The contestant sitting across from him heard the comment and immediately frowned at his own display. Was the human pretending to be uncertain, or was he genuinely confused? That single question lingered just long enough to make him hesitate. Another contestant noticed the hesitation and changed her own choice. Within seconds, uncertainty spread around the table like a ripple moving across still water. Mason watched it happen without saying another word. Director Salith folded his hands behind his back. "Do you see it?" he quietly asked the researchers beside him. One analyst nodded slowly. "The game is changing because they believe the human knows something." "Does he?" another researcher asked. Salith looked through the glass at Mason, who was scratching notes on a paper pad instead of staring at the digital interface. "No," he answered. "He simply accepts that he does not know." That answer settled over the room more heavily than anyone expected. The Institute had spent generations trying to eliminate uncertainty. Humans, on the other hand, seemed to carry uncertainty with them every day. Mortgage payments, weather forecasts, traffic jams, business meetings, raising children, career changes. They made important decisions without perfect information because life rarely offered perfect information. Suddenly, the final sequence began. Every contestant had one last opportunity to commit to a single decision that would determine the overall standings. Mathematical models immediately recommended an aggressive strategy with the highest projected return. 3 contestants selected it without hesitation. Another chose the safest possible option, hoping everyone else would make mistakes. Mason looked at both recommendations and quietly shook his head. Neither one feels right. Lisa Reynolds would later ask him what he was thinking during those final seconds. Mason's answer never changed. Nothing complicated, he said. Everybody in that room was trying to beat the game. I was trying not to lie to myself. He chose a balanced option that offered neither the highest reward nor the lowest risk. On paper, it was almost boring. Yet it fit the one thing he actually knew. He understood his own limits. When the final calculations finished, the chamber became completely silent. Mason had not dominated the competition. He had not won every round. He had simply made fewer unnecessary mistakes than everyone else. That difference proved decisive. The scoreboard slowly illuminated across the curved wall. Mason Carter finished first by a narrow margin that no simulation had predicted at the beginning of the event. No cheering followed. No applause erupted. The scholars remained seated, staring at the results as though the numbers themselves had become unfamiliar. One young researcher finally broke the silence. He did not defeat probability. Director Salif nodded. No, he defeated the illusion that probability alone explains intelligent decisions. Mason looked up at the scoreboard, blinked twice, and let out a quiet laugh. Well, he said as he gathered his notes, I definitely was not expecting that. Then he thanked the staff, picked up his coffee, and walked toward the exit because he still had an early shuttle to catch the next morning. As the automatic doors closed behind him, nobody inside the chamber spoke for nearly a full minute. For the first time, the greatest experts on probability in the galaxy realized they had spent years studying random outcomes while overlooking the one variable they could never reduce to an equation: human nature. Years passed before Director Salif spoke publicly about Mason Carter again. By then, the reports had circulated through universities, casinos, shipping guilds, diplomatic academies, and military leadership programs across known space. Most readers expected to find a revolutionary formula hidden inside the Institute's research. They searched for secret algorithms, psychological tricks, or advanced theories that could be copied. They found none. The official conclusion disappointed many scholars because it sounded almost too simple. Human beings did not possess supernatural intuition. They did not alter probability. They did not see the future. They simply accepted uncertainty better than most civilizations ever had. Quietly, without fanfare, policies began changing. Casino managers updated employee manuals. Tournament organizers added new guidelines for exhibition events. Training programs stopped treating human opponents as statistical anomalies and started teaching recruits to study emotional decision-making alongside mathematics. Eventually, one sentence appeared in manuals throughout the galaxy. If a human joins a game of chance, remember that you are no longer playing only against the game. Director Salif never admitted that the sentence had been inspired by Mason, but everyone inside the Institute knew exactly where it came from. As for Mason, life returned to normal almost immediately. He went back to Orion Freight Analytics on Monday morning, answered emails that had piled up during his trip, apologized for being behind on a quarterly report, and spent his lunch break helping a new employee understand the company's routing software. When Lisa Reynolds teased him about becoming famous across half the galaxy, Mason laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Trust me, he said. If anybody remembers me next month, I will be surprised. He truly meant it. Several months later, Director Salif traveled to Earth for an economic conference. After finishing his presentation, he found a small neighborhood restaurant that Mason had once recommended during a conversation between games. The place smelled of smoked brisket, fresh bread, and brewed coffee. Families talked over one another. Children laughed in the corner. Waitresses carried plates with practiced ease. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Near the window sat Mason, wearing the same faded baseball cap, sharing lunch with Lisa and 2 coworkers while arguing about which local team had the best chance of making the playoffs. Salif stood there for a moment before walking over. Mason looked up and smiled with immediate recognition. Director Saleth, he said warmly. Good to see you again. Have you tried the pecan pie? It is worth the flight by itself. Saleth smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. May I ask you one final question? Sure. What was your greatest advantage in every game we watched? Mason thought for several seconds before answering. Probably the fact that I never expected life to be fair. Saleth remained silent. Mason continued. Where I grew up, things did not always go according to plan. You lose jobs. You miss opportunities. Good people have bad days. You make the best decision you can with what you know, then you wake up tomorrow and do it again. That is not gambling. That is just living. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Outside the restaurant, people hurried along the sidewalk without realizing a conversation that would reshape interstellar education had just ended over coffee and pie. Years later, when new students asked Director Saleth why so many civilizations had become cautious whenever humans sat down at a gaming table, he no longer answered with equations or research papers. He simply smiled and said, because the wisest people are not the ones who believe they can control every outcome. They are the ones who know themselves well enough to remain steady when nobody else can. Learn that lesson, and it will help you far beyond any game you will ever play.